A lot of people now point to the Venezuelan model of saying, well, Maduro was seized by Delta Force, and of course his deputy, we now think, had already had some preparatory discussions on a sort of, if the boss were to disappear, would you be up for standing in sort of thing, basis with the CIA. So could there be such an understanding with senior commanders in the Revolutionary Guards in Iran or another senior clerical figure? Possibly, but I think it's much less likely than in the Venezuelan context.
And Mark Urban is here, as he is every Monday, to talk us through the big foreign policy, diplomatic and defence stories. Hello, Mark.
Good morning.
Welcome back. Let's talk about Iran. Donald Trump has said that negotiations over Iran's nuclear program are ongoing, while he's also continuing to build US military presence in the region. Iran's supreme leader warned that any US attack would trigger a widespread regional conflict. Speaking on Air Force One, Trump said essentially that there's only one way to find out if that's true.
We have the biggest, most powerful ships in the world over there, very close, a couple of days, and hopefully we'll make a deal. If we don't make a deal, then we'll find out whether or not he was right.
Mark, it seems to me that you look at what Trump is planning, what the White House is planning, and they seem to have this thing. It's like they've done a flowchart, which has gone, send lots of ships and military to the Middle East, Iran, and then when one branch goes off to Iran buckles and we negotiate, and the other branch just has a question mark next to it. What is the plan here? If Iran resists, I mean, what kind of military actions could we be talking about? Are we talking about military actions? Is any of this really doing anything?
Well, I mean, it's fascinating, isn't it? I think when we spoke last week, we talked about this Trumpian template of a deal, and we just heard it again. And obviously, some people, like Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, are not really amenable to that way of thinking. Oh, let's just sew this up by the end of the week. Something they've been contesting with outside powers,
since 1979. Yeah.
Well, and indeed the nuclear issue, certainly, for many years now. And it then leaves the big question, of course, or else, and then people will say, is this a Trump always chickens out moment, or does he go into combat, which is a very long circumnavigation back to your question about what actually are his options. We simply don't know. I mean, I can look at the deployment of forces there and say, well, he's got a lot more options than he had a couple of weeks ago when this current crisis started, when frankly he would have been limited to a few cruise missiles and maybe some B-2 bombers flying from the United States. He's got a lot more options now. Obviously, he's got carrier air groups. He's got fighter bombers based in Jordan now. He's got things like the submarine-launched cruise missiles, which have been there throughout, probably within range. So there are lots of options. So the question is, on that list of options, does he go for something rather tokenistic? Because he said, that line about if you don't stop killing people, we'll retaliate sort of thing. So does he go for a tokenistic thing to show that he's not chickening out? And then you go up the options right the way to sort of full regime change, targeting Ayatollah Khamenei himself, things like that, which would clearly in a Iranian and regional context be really big escalation, really big employment of military force, and potentially open-ended. Because the idea that Ali Khamenei isn't aware of the risks to his own life and taking precautions, or that even if you kill him,
well, it's not like the Iranian Liberal Democrats just step in, is it? I mean, it doesn't necessarily change.
Although you can, of course, a lot of people now point to the Venezuelan model of saying, well, Maduro was seized by Delta Force, and of course his deputy, we now think, had already had some preparatory discussions on a sort of, if the boss were to disappear, would you be up for standing in sort of thing, basis with the CIA. So could there be such an understanding with senior commanders in the Revolutionary Guards in Iran or another senior clerical figure? Possibly, but I think it's much less likely than in the Venezuelan context. So, all sorts of options. And of course, don't forget, Iran has a vote. as we saw during the conflict with Israel May, June last year, firing hundreds of ballistic missiles at Tel Aviv, firing missiles at Qatar, and potentially it's the thing they love to threaten, but would, I think, hesitate to do for lots of reasons, closing the Strait of Hormuz with that big slice of the world's oil supply coming through.
Well, this is what I was going to ask about that huge military force that they've got, that the Americans have got there. Does that look to you, from a military perspective, does that look to you like an attacking force, or does that look to you like a deterrent force, that if they were to do something smaller, this is what prevents Iran doing whatever thing Iran would do in response?
Yeah, it's a very good question. And of course, it has to be both. And in fact, I think when we spoke last week, I said, well, I felt that last week the last elements would fall into place. Now, the people who are monitoring the arrivals of, transport aircraft from Texas or whatever that might be carrying out air defence batteries would suggest that I maybe was a little bit ahead of myself, and that perhaps we reach that moment this week, perhaps next week. And this is the moment where, as we saw a couple of times last year, the Americans reinforce air defence in the region. So you've got the fighters in Jordan, for example, that can shoot down cruise missiles if Iran decides to fire them at Israel. We've no idea whether Israel would or wouldn't join in an attack with the Americans, but there's a reasonable assumption that Iran might try to bring on some kind of regional conflagration. But of course, the targets that fly much faster and dive in from a ballistic trajectory, long-range missiles, can't be shot down by those fighters in Jordan. And that's why you need things like the Theater high-altitude air defence system, which is a very exotic and expensive missile defence system, which the Americans did send there last year to protect the Israelis. And you need Patriot and other things which they sent to protect some of their Gulf allies. And those systems are still deploying. So that's part of the answer, is that you have to be configured to strike, but that you then also, like a good strategist, have to think a couple of steps ahead to what Iran might do in response.
Yeah, well, we will see. There's anything to say, but we will. Look, you've been reporting in the Sunday Times about Britain's disastrous Ajax armoured vehicle programme. You've been visiting the factory. Tell us about that little disaster.
Well, this is also absolutely up in the news, because last November there was an exercise in which the Household Cavalry Regiment and one or two other people were using dozens of these new vehicles. Deliveries are going on apace, in fact. And around 35 of those soldiers complained of motion sickness, throwing up, headaches, other symptoms. So suddenly a vehicle which most of us thought, OK, it's probably on the right track now, there were new questions, because back in 2020, trials were stopped because soldiers doing the trials were suffering from the effects of noise and vibration. All sorts of mitigations had to be introduced, etc., etc. The general view was that the problem had been sorted. I mean, there's £6 billion pounds at stake here in this order, nearly 600 vehicles. It's critical for the army, and now they've got this new problem. So in the next, possibly this week or next week, an army safety investigation as to why those soldiers fell ill on that exercise in November should produce a result. And if it sort of says, well, they were spending too much time looking at screens, much like your kids on the way up to your trips to Scotland or whatever, that could be an answer on the motion sickness, vomiting, stuff like that. But
does the thing have windows?
It depends where you are in it. Right. So some of the people operating it can just stick their heads out the top. Yeah. But there's always situations in the military where you have to have the hatches closed, and you have to rely on the, either because that's the tactical situation that you're practicing, or you're practicing a circumstance where someone has used chemical weapons, or whatever, as part of your exercise. I mean, look, I can tell you, putting on my old soldier's beret from 40-something years ago, I mean, I was once in the back of an armoured vehicle with no way of looking out on a night march for about 5 hours. I literally fell out of the back. I didn't throw up, but I had very bad motion sickness. So it can happen with any vehicle, but of course the spotlight is on Ajax because of all these problems to do with vibration and potential damage to people's hearing that cropped up earlier in the programme.
But Mark, this is obviously about more than just one tank, because as we're talking about dramatically increasing military spending.
Totally.
I guess, the problem we don't seem to focus on nearly enough, the question, is what we actually spend it on. It's no good spending another £6 billion on a tank if that tanker's a disaster.
Totally.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you'll hear opinions divided on this, and as a result of my article, I've had some people get in touch, And it's got to be said, some of them are very positive about the vehicle. Some of them say it's a disaster, exactly what you've said. Just stop spending money on it, bin it, find something else. I think for the government there are some big problems. You allude to we are embracing all this rhetoric about retooling our industries for rearmament, getting ready for possible military action. And lo and behold, you've got this factory in Wales that is really churning these out in tank terms at quite a rate. They're building up to 12 a month. Before the invasion of Ukraine, a couple of dozen a year was what Europe was producing in tanks. So they are producing at quite a rate, but of course, no good if the vehicle is a problem for the soldiers. I think the really big issue here for the army, which I think is pretty determined to keep this thing, and the government in presenting it, is they've got this thing. Confidence has been damaged among soldiers now, and somehow they've got to sell it to their own soldiers as well as to the wider public that this is a good use of that money, and at a time when about a third of the vehicles in the contract have been delivered and accepted. So they're bang in the middle of it, and it would take years, maybe 5 years, if you cancelled it, to come up with an alternative. So they are between the proverbial rock and hard place.
Finally, Mark, the Rafa crossing linking Egypt and the Gaza Strip is going to open for the first time in nearly 2 years today. It's part of it's the first phase of Donald Trump's Gaza peace plan, but it comes amid obvious continued uncertainty over Gaza's future governance. How significant is this as an opening?
Look, it is significant. I think people in Gaza were really yearning for this because of the war. Communications have been really difficult. I mean, one of the little-known things is that during the first year of the war, when Egypt was still controlling and the Palestinian Hamas authorities were controlling their side, so before the Israelis took Rafa, which was several months into the war, something like 150,000 Gazans did leave through the Rafa crossing. So, of course, for them and their families, there has been the question since then about how do they get back. Once the Israelis had taken the Rafah crossing and the whole thing had been demolished and destroyed, there was this question about those people, mostly in Egypt, how could they get back? And of course, there's the ongoing question: people with medical or family situations, how do they get out? So yes, it's a big moment for people in Gaza if they can travel in and out again through that crossing point, I guess in that sense it's to be welcomed.
I mean, is there a link here with what's going on with Iran? Because presumably if some kind of conflict begins with Iran, one of the first things they do is close crossings like these.
I don't know.
The fact that it's with Egypt maybe makes
I don't know. Yeah, it might be that the Israeli security people would want that. I mean, look, they're now in a position where they've got the Palestinian side of the crossing. So, of course, they can conduct very close scrutiny of the people going in and out, which is something they always want to do. I think the other wider question on this is, what if this turns into a portal for large-scale departures? From Gaza? The Egyptian government is very sensitive about that. If we were to discover in 6 months' time that 500,000 people had gone out through that crossing point, I think that would be severely embarrassing to the Egyptian government. So there are lots of sensitivities about how it's going to operate in the next few months.
Mark Urban, thank you very much indeed. And you can, I should have said, you can watch Mark's report on the Ajax on thetimes.com right now. Mark Urban, thanks very much for being with us. Always a joy to have you here.